Okay, we're going to get going now for this next panel so we can then go right into lunch. We're very honored today to have the former director of President Barack Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing here with us. He took time out of his busy schedule. I've learned that he's flown, I think, across country now. This will be his second trip in a week, and then he'll be back in Chicago and the like. So we're really thankful to have him in the room today to talk about the work of the task force. He's also the former chief of Oakland, the former head of the cops division of the DOJ, and just a real thought leader in policing in the U.S. and internationally. He's going to start off with a presentation on some of his work, and then we're going to go into a moderated panel on what's happening here in Connecticut, led by Bill Dyson. And
let me do one thing before we get started, and that is, I know we all spread out, but if you could come forward a little bit, we would appreciate that very much. If you decide not to do it, I understand. But if you could move forward, we'd love to have you do that. Thank you.
And one quick housekeeping, there was a black case found in one of the breakout rooms, so if someone wants it, I'll have it over here. So, without further ado, Ron Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, now hold it. You even haven't eaten yet. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I appreciate that. It is very nice to be here. I guess I'm leaving tonight. I'm going to have to change my flight. I guess you guys got some snow coming. I'm from California, so that's a unique thing. And the last 3.5 years when I spent in the administration in D.C., if it gets even a quarter inch of snow, the whole city shuts down. So it's really weird. I grew up in Philadelphia, and if it was less than 6 inches, unfortunately, you still had to go to school. So as mentioned, my name is Ron Davis. I'm the former director of the COPS office. How many people here know what the COPS office is? Probably the law enforcement people do, because that's a granting component where we used to put out hundreds of millions of dollars a year to support the hiring of police officers, training, and advancing community policing. And when I took that job in 2013, that was after 30 years of career. I spent 20 years in Oakland. I left Oakland as a captain, become chief in a city called East Palo Alto, both cities very unique, but East Palo Alto was very unique, and that unfortunately had earned the title of murder capital of the United States in 1992. And it was a community rich in diversity and a lot of opportunities, but plagued with a lot of issues of crime and violence. So I left policing after 30 years to go to the Obama administration to become the COPS office director. Now, when I started this in 2013, it was interesting because I was thinking about all the things I would do to advance community policing, what I had learned in Oakland, what I learned in East Palo Alto. I was a big supporter of reentry, working with the state correctional rehabilitation system. And then in 2014, if you recall, Michael Brown was shot and killed in the city of Ferguson. Then it was followed shortly by Eric Gardner, who died in New York, and a series of high-profile cases. At that time, President Obama then decided he needed to put together a task force to try to come up with some recommendations. Now, if you're in D.C., in many cases, a task force is a code word for put it on the shelf, right? In other words, we'll study it for a year and a half, we'll come up with a nice report, we'll make it look good, and then we'll put it on the shelf. But the president was very clear. And so he named me the executive director, which on one hand was great because the president is tapping you to do something. On the other hand, it's scary as heck because now if you fail, you failed for the president. And he turned around and says, well, look, we want this thing done in 90 days. Once again, if you know D.C., nothing gets done in 90 days. And he said this over the holiday, but he said, I don't want a long task force. I want your task force to come up with recommendations on how to build this trust between community and police while still making sure that we can be very safe and fight crime and violence. He then named 11 individuals. Now, this is where the part became interesting. As you do your work, this probably comes into play. He found 11 of the most diverse individuals I could possibly imagine, and it made me wonder how we could actually figure out what time to meet, let alone recommendations on how to advance policing. And we had everybody from police chiefs with 30, 40 years, like myself, to civil rights activists who just came off the lines in Ferguson and in New York, to academics. My good colleague, she is a civil rights attorney in LA, Her name is Connie Rice. She does a lot of national work. Well, she introduced herself. She goes, hey, my name is Connie Rice. Nice to meet you. I sue LAPD for a living. And I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be a very interesting panel, and we're going to have to do this in 90 days. But we decided that instead of trying to become a think tank and to think about how we could solve the problems, that it would be better to go out into the field. That all the work that you guys are doing right now is a better way to learn and to advance than trying to make stuff up. So we held listening sessions around the country so that we could hear from civil rights activists, police departments, unions, community advocacies, formerly incarcerated, academics, everyone. But we built the series around 6 pillars. We put the report around 6 pillars. The first one was building trust and legitimacy, the idea that nothing can really happen in policing if the police don't have the trust of the community and are not viewed as legitimate. And why that word legitimacy is very important, because it's different than the word legality. And too often we judge police departments by whether the action was legal. Was the shooting legal? Was the use of force legal? Was the stop legal? And as you deal with racial profiling, in many cases, you give me a vehicle code in a car, in about 10 seconds, I will find a legal pretext to stop you. But that doesn't give me legitimacy if that majority of the stops I'm doing are African American. They're based on a racial bias, and basically we're on a fishing expedition with the stereotype that men of color commit crime. So this was, how do you build trust and legitimacy? The second one was policy and oversight. How do you provide oversight for police departments and make sure they have policies that represent the best practices of the field? There was community policing and crime reduction. And we struggled with this one because we wanted community policing to me involves crime reduction, but too often people think community policing is a program. If I have coffee with a cop, I've done community policing. If I hold a meeting, I've done community policing. If I play with the kids in some basketball, that's community policing. That's community engagement. Is very important, but community policing is a philosophy. It's the belief that the way you fight crime is by co-producing public safety with the community, which means your residents should help you define the problem, identify solutions, and you hold each other mutually accountable for those activities that you're engaging in on behalf of the community. As I used to tell my officers, the badge that I give you is not yours. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the community. They're loaning it to you. They're giving it to you so that you can do things on their behalf. So that badge, that power doesn't belong to the police. It belongs to the community. And so we want to make sure that also that the crime reduction strategies were evidence-based and do not result in the kind of disparities that we've seen over the last 50 plus years. And I was thinking about this yesterday. I was in Berkeley at a conference. It was looking at 50 years since the Kerner Commission. It was the anniversary of that commission where it identified that we were heading for 2 societies, one black and one white. And where have we gone in 50 years? And as I share with the group, being 54, most of my life is during that period of time. I should have told you 54. I should have just said 34. But anyway, I'm way past line these days. But being 54, most of that was part of my life. And I thought about the first time I walked into the police academy in Oakland and looking at the room and looking at the diversity and having a deputy chief look at me and look at other officers of color, about 3 or 4 of us out of a class of 30, and to make the statement, many of you here because of affirmative action, which bursted my bubble at the time, but then came back saying, now how you get evaluated is what you do. So on one hand, then I appreciate affirmative action because it was designed to level the playing field. On the other hand, once you get the opportunity, it's up to you to go through the doors. So I didn't know if he offered it that way, but I just figured I would take it that way anyway. But anyway, but I also know as a father of a black son, I have 2 daughters, but primarily as a 20-year-old son, that even though I've been in this game for 30 plus years, I still had to have a talk with him. He's now a junior at Northwestern, but he was 16. Before I could hand him the keys, my wife and I had to talk to him about what to do when stopped by the police. And that is a mandatory course for young men of color in this country. And until we get to the point that that's not a course, then we need to focus on community policing and crime reduction. The other pillar was training and education. The idea of how we train cops is how they'll behave, how they'll act, and also education, that they understand more about the profession and act like a profession and not a vocation. Right? A profession has a national body of knowledge, a national standards. People are held accountable to the standards. This is not a vocation. There's nothing wrong with vocation, but we want professionals that live up to the best practices and engage in evidence and adopt, like the medical field does, do no harm first. So simply telling me that you can reduce crime by 5% if you're harming the community to get there is very counterproductive. We also looked at technology and social media, and the idea that departments should be using technology to advance accountability, to be more efficient and effective. and also social media as well. And then the sixth pillar was officer safety and wellness. And there was a lot of debate about what does this have to do with community policing. To be honest with you, we fought very hard that this was very important. And if you notice, pillar 1 was building trust and legitimacy. Pillar 6 is community policing. So I identified those are the bookends of effective community policing in the 21st century. If you don't gain the trust of the community and you're not viewed legitimately, you will not be able to fight and sustain crime reduction. If you don't take care of your officers and make them a part of the community, you will not be able to fight crime and you still will not be successful. So those are the bookends that hold everything together. Hopefully, when the panel will discuss what that means and how you translate this into actual policies. Let me applaud this state. Let me applaud your efforts with the racial profiling and how you're advancing. Data collection, in my opinion, is probably one of the most critical parts and the shortages that we have in the field today. The idea that I cannot tell you as a profession how many people we shoot and kill is unacceptable. The idea that we cannot manage how many stops we have to see that if we have disparate outcomes, unintended or not. If you're the one being stopped, there's no such thing as unintended, it's just harm. The idea that we don't measure the things that are important to us. As a former cop, I know a couple things. Whatever you expect, you will inspect, and you will also manage the things that measure. That you measure the things that matter to you. And so if you don't collect the data, then you're telling me it's not important. If you don't inspect my activities, then you're telling me it's not important. We have a unique opportunity, and everything that the Obama administration put in right now, to be very candid, is being undone. Now, here's the beauty of it. It doesn't matter what happens in D.C. It only matters what you do at this level, at the local and state level, because the Attorney General of the United States does not provide direction to the police chief in the back of the room. They can provide guidance and money, but it's up to you to provide that direction, so you set the goals, and if 21st century policing is it, I think we have a good roadmap to start with, and I congratulate you on your efforts thus far, and I look forward to our talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And what we'll do now is introduce the other members of the panel here. And we'll start with my friend Tamara. Tamara, will you tell this group who you are and any comments you may have about 21st century?
Good afternoon. My name is Tamara Lanier. I am a retired chief probation officer after 27 years. I've also been involved with the Connecticut NAACP for the last 15 years, and I am the criminal justice chair. I am a member of the Racial Profiling Prohibition Project, and we've been engaged in activities for the last 4 or 5 years, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Tamara. And Tamara is followed by Chief Neil Dryfe. We serve on the profiling group together that I chair, and the chief represents the Police Association, Chiefs Association for the state of Connecticut. And he's been a decent person to work with, a very decent person to work with. So, Chief, go ahead.
I'm going to try to improve from decent at some point. As Mr. Dyson said, my name is Neil Dryfe. I've been a police officer for 28 years in the state of Connecticut, 21 years with Hartford before I retired and joined the Cheshire Police Department as the chief in 2011. I've had the pleasure of representing the Connecticut Police Chiefs Association on the Racial Profiling Prohibition Project for probably about 2 years now. Been involved with what I hope was not just programs, but the philosophy of community policing for most of my my career. And again, I look forward to the discussion also. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we'll hold applause for later on. Thank you very much. And next we'll go to Ken Barone, who staffs the Profile Commission, the studying the data that's collected. Ken, go right ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As Bill said, my name is Ken Barone. I'm with the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at the university here, and I've been managing the state of Connecticut's racial profiling initiative since the state tried to rethink the way that we go about collecting and analyzing data in 2012. And more recently, I've also been helping the state of Rhode Island implement the similar program we use in Connecticut in Rhode Island. And my introduction to 21st century policing in particular, and the work that President Obama's task force did back in 2015, really came more recently when I worked with, in the state of Connecticut, there was a task force that spent the better part of a year trying to rethink and look at how we do police training in the state of Connecticut, and what they used as a guide for their discussion and how they think about potentially rethinking police training were the 6 pillars in that task force report. And so the task force work has started to guide some of the work that different groups throughout Connecticut have tried to do when trying to look at ways to improve policing. And it's also been a document that we've been able to think about and use more recently in our work here in the state of Connecticut as we try and grapple with the disparities that we continue to see in police traffic enforcement and other areas that we study.
Thank you very much. Now, let me see if I can get you to branch off into having a discussion that incorporates members of the audience here. Then I assume there'll be questions with the microphones that are here that you'll be able to come up and ask the questions you would like to have asked. But in regards to the 21st century and the comments just made here by Mr. Davis, I know that many of you probably have your own ideas about what should or should not be, and probably have some thoughts about the proposal that he talked about. So what I want to first do is get the panel itself to give some comments about this plan, the 21st century. Where are we? What's the likelihood? Are we just singing Dixie, or is it Yankee Doodle? What is it? So we can start off. Anyone like to volunteer and be the first to start here? Tamara, you want to start?
Well, the report, the work that went into it, a phenomenal report, great information, great resource. It has circulated the country. The police departments have access to it. It's a great thing. The problem that I see, it's paper and not practice. And so what I would hope to see as we work with the police departments across the state is not only do they have this embedded in their policy, but they make measured steps to ensure that it's a part of their practice.
Well, let me kind of do a retort to that. Do you have the sense that there will not be follow-up here? Tamara?
I think one of the themes that we've heard throughout the morning is speaking truth and speaking the truth. And I would say in the state of Connecticut, we have police departments who are really vested in this. And in some parts of our community, we have police departments who are resistant to this. And so our goal as NAACP branches and NAACP units are to work with those police departments so that these policies, these 6 bullets, are embedded in their policy, but also enforced in terms of it being their practice, and that there be oversight so that we can ensure that what's going on in the field is monitored and there's some form of accountability for their lack of cooperation or compliance with the policy.
Thank you. Chief, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I guess I'm somewhat like, I don't want to go off on a political kind of rant, but certainly it's been mentioned earlier by some of the other panelists who were speaking in this room about changes under the Trump administration. I know Mr. Davis can probably speak to those, but certainly the refocusing of the Justice Department away from helping police departments in many cases, but in other cases actually monitoring and investigating local police departments for abuses is something that I don't think bodes well. A refocusing, again, we just spent a whole hour and a half talking about drug policy, and again, the refocusing of the Justice Department to concentrate more on almost reinvigorating the war on drugs is something, again, I don't think bodes well for a lot of the building blocks of the 21st century policing report. But as Mr. Davis also said, I don't take direction from the Trump administration or anybody else in Washington, D.C., right? Policing in this country, and in this state in particular, is local. All policing is local. There's, again, a lot of people think we have way too many police departments for a state our size, over 100. And it's a difficult, kind of framework to kind of work through. But I think on the state level, we've done a tremendous job in embracing a lot of the pillars here, a lot of the training, and I think we didn't just like suddenly happen upon this 2 years ago. We've been doing it for many years, and again, I don't think there's any real reason why we won't continue to do that in the state of Connecticut. I think the leadership is there. There's not a police chief that I know who doesn't have at heart improving the level of service that they provide to their communities. And, again, I think that's going to be something that we continue to do, even if national trends kind of take things in another direction. And again, I think that there's a tremendous amount. You see a lot of pushback, particularly on the West Coast now, to the Trump administration's immigration policies, and I think that's indicative of what I think happens on the local and state level across the country. Not just because the Trump administration or the federal government has kind of re-energized and refocused its efforts towards immigration enforcement. There are tremendous other police chiefs all over the country who are standing up and saying, no, we're not going to do that. And politicians and a lot of other people too. It's not just police, but certainly there's a fair share of police officers who are saying, we're not going to do that. That's not how we're going to conduct ourselves. And I think that bodes well for, keeping the reforms moving in the right directions.
Ken, you have any comments, or should I skip you at this point?
The only thing I would add is that in my experience in working in particular on the racial profiling initiative for the last 6 years, progress is slow because what we're talking about oftentimes are cultural changes, and maybe I'd like to actually get Ron to talk a bit about how what the task force proposed is really, in some respects, really challenging the culture of policing. The one thing that I've learned, however, is that law enforcement can be very responsive to their community. And what I mean by that is we've seen examples of law enforcement maybe engaging in certain practices that are causing a racial disparity or could be perceived potentially as racial profiling. And the community where sometimes this occurs is okay with that, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that if we want 21st century policing to occur and to be, the motto of all police departments in Connecticut and across the country, it's really got to come from the communities and from the people that those law enforcement professionals serve, right? And so that means that folks have to show up to forums and to events and to organize, and again, not to necessarily, just be opposing to what law enforcement are trying to do, but to be a part of the conversation, right? Because the people that show up, they're the ones who have their voices heard the most, right? And I've found in my experience that in some of the areas in this state where I myself am personally maybe troubled by some of what we see when we dig in and look at some of the data, the communities that show up to participate in the conversation about what the data says and what it means and why it says what it says, they tend to be okay with the unintended or intended outcome of what's occurring. right? And the other side of the equation isn't there. And so I think the same is true for 21st century policing. If we want law enforcement, there are some great law enforcement leaders like the chief next to me who are in this state and in other states who are aware of this document, who have read this document, and who try and spread the philosophy of 21st century policing throughout their departments. But that doesn't occur everywhere, and in fact, I would venture to guess that it occurs in fewer departments than we would like. And so that means that folks in the state, not just legislators, but community members need to make this a priority for policing if they really want it to be embraced throughout the state. We have 107 police departments. That's a lot of people to get on board to all aspects of these 6 pillars.
Thank you. Now, the report indicated a need for a change in culture. I'm not sure what that means, so I'm going to ask Mr. Davis to talk to us about a change in culture. What does it look like? How do we get there? What's needed?
So first, let me make sure everybody understands how the American policing system works. You mentioned there's 100+ police departments in Connecticut. There are over 17,000 local, county, and state police agencies in the United States, all controlled at the local level or at the state level. Out of that 17,000, the vast majority, something like 70%, are departments with 50 or fewer police officers and or deputies. So the system is made up of 16 to 17,000 independent small agencies with about 60 major cities scattered throughout the country that covers it. And so the question is, and under our form of government, the federal government does not have oversight of those departments. So there is no federal policy, there's no national policy. And so to change the culture, you have to figure out how do you get to 16,000 individual agencies. And when we did the task force report, the way we did it is we work with, like any other profession, we have associations. We have police union associations, we have chiefs associations, we have sheriff's association, and part of their task force was to bring them in to talk, to listen to them. And what we did with the federal government is to incentivize their involvement by providing grants to advance 21st century policing. So for example, one way you change the culture is training. We did a convening when I was a director, bringing in all 50 state directors of the posts, which are the state bodies that govern training for the state in most places. So instead of trying to reach 100 agencies, if you can hit the training commission for that state, they can mandate training on those pillars to those 100 agencies. And if you hit all 50 states and then 6 territories, Commonwealth territories, you can get to the vast majority of police agencies. But the way you change cultures, you have to change the practice, you have to change the incentive, you have to change the way they do things, and you have to change the community. You know, the power that the federal government had is the power of the purse, the ability to give grants. So I could incentivize things. When we put out this task force report, within the next 2 years, we put out close to $300 million from my office in grants for agencies that were committed to implementing the 59 recommendations that are in there. We also work with states that were passing laws. For example, one of the recommendations in the task force report is that the police, if an officer involves shooting, that the police should not investigate themselves. And so instead of a police department investigating his own shooting, that it has to be a naming jurisdiction or another entity that should come in. Some states have now passed that as state law. Some have even gone as far as recommending that their prosecutor be different, that it be a special prosecutor because of the relationship between the police department and the district attorney on a daily basis. We require things like de-escalation training that shows how to deal with people that are in mental crisis so you don't misinterpret the assault or misinterpret the actions and go to higher levels of force. Many states are putting that not only in their curriculum, they're putting that in state law. So the way that we can change the culture is we have to really show that this is the way the policing that the community wants to go forward with. And as the chief mentioned, by 8 years as a chief, I've never taken a direction from the Attorney General. If they provided a grant that I wanted that was aligned with me, then I would apply for it. But if he's going in a different direction, whomever he or she is, then it's the local community. You want to make sure that the chief at the table and all 16,000 chiefs realize that the direction that they need to go comes from you, that you understand those 59 recommendations, that you hold them accountable, and it's going to take time and consistency to change culture. Because we have a thing about culture. Culture will eat policy for lunch every day of the week. So just writing fancy paper, as my colleague said, means nothing if the culture is there. And so the way you change culture is through paper, but it's through diversity, it's through practice, it's through accountability. Police officers know one thing. As a former chief, they know what I'm going to get them for when they mess up. They know what I'm going to ignore, and they know it's a priority for me. And I just think about silly things. When I was in Oakland, for some reason, my chief was big back in the 80s, into hat. You had to wear your hat, right? Now, you could drive through the streets 100 miles an hour, crash 50 cars, but if you had your hat on, you were in good shape. If you didn't have your hat on, you got disciplined. So what do you think cops did? Wore the hats. And if you basically pull up on a scene and you didn't have your hat and the captain pulled up, you see people diving into cars trying to grab their hats because everyone knew the chief was big on hats. So imagine if the chief was big on impartial policing. Imagine if the chief was big on fairness and equity and making sure there's diversity. Imagine if the chief was big on looking at uses of force beyond whether or not they're legal, but whether they're necessary. Could they have been prevented? If these things occur, then you start changing the culture. But you got to stay true to it. It's not going to happen overnight.
Just if I could jump in off of what Ron said.
Go ahead, Ken.
Real quick story. There was not in the state of Connecticut, in the state of Rhode Island, but I won't say what department. There's a police department that the chief refused, to this day, he refuses to have his officers collect traffic stop data and report it to the state as mandated by law, right? And the state basically throws up their hands and says, well, what are we going to do about it, right? I mean, there are a lot of the times these laws don't have teeth in them to be able to, go after the department financially. I mean, I suppose somebody could try and file a lawsuit, but essentially the state says, well, I don't know, it's 1 out of 39, so not so bad. But just as I'm listening to Ron talk, I'm thinking to myself, now what kind of culture is established in that police department when just something as basic as, which everybody else is participating in, collecting information for the purposes of analysis and research, is said this isn't a priority at all, and in fact we're gonna say no to a mandate that the state has. So when you talk about culture, right, and how all of this can be local, right, when you have local leaders and local police chiefs that are taking this stuff seriously and following through on it because it's the right thing to do, right, you're more likely to be able to have trust, legitimacy, and all the important pillars that you need to make policing work. But cultures really can be dictated from the top on down. And unfortunately, in my work, I see it often in numerous states.
Can I add
Thank
something?
you. Tamara, go right ahead.
And just to piggyback off the diversity piece, I mean, again, the leadership of a police department has a lot to say about the culture. The leadership has a lot to say about the culture. And if there's no commitment to diversity, not only diversity, but also recruiting people from your community. Oftentimes what we see in police departments is that they're recruiting from other parts of the state where the officers have no commitment to the community that they serve. So there has to be, on a leadership scale, a commitment to diversity, commitment to recruiting locally, and also the technology piece is big. Because when we meet with police departments, they think they've arrived, they think they have it, that they've done it. And when we show them the data that says otherwise, or we show them the surveys from the community that says you don't have a good relationship, then they start to reevaluate. So all of those things are important.
Yes, go right ahead, Mr. Davis.
I want to give a caution on the diversity. So, unfortunately, we're showing studies that, depending on the level of diversity, on how it would impact the department, going back to culture. The police culture is a very strong culture, and it can override individuals that come into an organization. You get into that indoctrination process. And what happens is it tries to, when I became a cop, the concept then was that we're all blue, you just happen to be black. So that you're a cop that happens to be black, and the pushback has to be is, no, I'm actually a cop, a black man that chose to be a cop. See, I can retire, and I have retired as a cop, but unless something changes, I'm pretty much going to probably stay black until I die. So that's not changing. And why that's important, because if I'm a black man that chose to be a cop versus a cop who happens to be something, then what I bring to the job is the experience of being an African-American male in America. And I bring to the table being an immigrant, if you're an immigrant, or gender diversity has so much benefit for uses of force and misconduct, it's unbelievable. But if that person goes into the organization and the culture surrounds them, then you'll see that even the officers of color will still be part of that culture and tradition and will engage in the same activities as if there was no diversity in the department. So it has to be every level of the organization, special assignments, training, and there's got to be a fight from the chiefs to make sure that why you value the diversity is because you value their perspective. Once when I was applying for a chief's job, one of the panelists asked me, do men and women police the same? So I'm thinking it's a trick question. I go, absolutely. You know, I'm doing that kind of stuff. And I thought about it, and I go, well, hold it. If they did, then what would be the benefit of that diversity? Well, yes, they put on handcuffs the same. They're going to drive the car the same. But the benefit is that I hope they don't police the same. That's the benefit. We can learn from each other. There's differences in that, and that's okay. So no, they don't. And that's why women are better at making arrests, resolving conflict, because men, we suffer from all kinds of inflictions called machismo and testosterone and everything else, and we got to fight our way to things. So when you increase diversity, you increase a lot for the agency. But as you're fighting for that in your agencies, make sure that you just don't get a visual diverse department. It has to be more than looks like it. It has to actually be like it, and that's when you can look at those assignments, those opportunities, that training, the promotions, and whether or not the officers of color in that organization have a strong and legitimate voice on all issues, not just black issues or women issues, on all issues.
Let me follow up on that. Supposing now you have this chief who represents a majority culture, who is of a mind to diversify its entire force. He has somewhat of a problem here, because does he run the risk of being overridden by the larger group within, or how does one handle trying to make that transition to being as diversified as Tamara said, or the problems associated with what you talked about? How do you do that? How's it get done?
I was going to share it real quick. I think the job of the chief, and the chief, hopefully the chief will reply to this too, is there's a lot of pressure on chiefs. In California's county chiefs, there's regional chiefs associations, national ones. I just decided a long time ago, and this is before I served in the Obama administration, that if my priority is my community, then the only people I should be worried about their opinion is my community and my officers. And so if my colleagues don't like it, that's just quite frankly tough. You know, I don't work for you, and you don't work for me, and I'm not here to serve you. And so my colleagues thought I was crazy when I entered into a reentry program 6 months after a parolee shot and killed one of my officers. Because the family and I had another question, is why would a guy with 6 months after being in prison be walking around with a gun? We want to know what could have been done to have prevented that versus declaring war on everybody on parole. And so to run reentry programs, to have formerly incarcerated people work in your department, people thought we were crazy. People thought we were crazy when we started collecting racial profiling data that they would want to follow. But I think what ends up happening is the chiefs that do that need to know that they're serving their community, and their reward is not being a pat on the back from your colleagues, although that's always nice. I mean, you got to engage with the field and the profession, but you serve your community. And if you're a progressive, fight it. And in your agency, I would say this to any police chief, this notion that officers will not do the job if they got to collect data, that they'll de-police, or the Ferguson effect, or there'll be like you name me another profession where the employees get to decide their workload. You imagine if you work for Ford Motor Company and go, you know what, you pissed me off today, boss, I'm not going to produce these cars. Or the hospital, no, you know what, I'm not going to treat you the right way because I don't like your attitude, and you got me filling another form. And so if you see de-policing, that means the chief has allowed it. If you see a pulling away from servicing the community, the chief has allowed it. And if the chief makes clear that's what he or she wants, the department will follow. believe wholeheartedly that the vast majority of the officers that are out there are doing a great job. I think we do them a disservice because the systems in which they're operating are failing them. We are still using systems that were designed 50 years ago. So when I hear people tell me that the system has failed, no, it has not. It has done exactly what it was designed to do. We have failed unless we change these systems, and that requires courageous leadership like the chief that's sitting at the table and probably many that you know.
Thank you. Chief, you can respond.
Sure. I mean, just not really a response, just kind of an echo chamber, I guess, to an extent. I agree. You know, there's a lot of the talk that was kind of generated around, I think, about, you know, everybody's gonna back off, and I agree wholeheartedly. That's not a failure of a police officer. That's a failure of a police chief. Again, just, you know, kind of the same thought. Where else do you go in life where, you know, somebody decides that, yeah, you know, I'm not going to do that today. And there's a lot of ways. We used to have a saying in Hartford, you know, they can make me go out there and drive around for 8 hours, but they can't make me see anything. But it was, you know, it came up every once in a while and quickly went away, and people went out there and did their jobs. And again, I agree with the system. You know, the comments that Mr. Davis just made about the system. You know, training is something that chronically has lagged behind, right? We're all catching up now with crisis intervention training and de-escalation training. But when did the community-based care for people in mental health crisis begin to be a big trend? It was decades ago. And it's only now that people are becoming aware of the fact that police officers are now also serving as frontline social workers, that this kind of emphasis has come around to the system has changed to put us in a position where we at least have some training in recognizing people in mental health crisis and how to respond to that. But again, understand what that is. It's 40 hours of police training, right? There's people who go to school forever to get PhDs who sometimes struggle to help people who are in the throes of a mental health crisis. We give police officers 40 hours and expect them to be able to resolve every single situation that they encounter. And by the way, understand most of those situations are when something has already gotten out of control. Many of those calls come from family members. So this is your son, your spouse, your niece, nephew, whatever the case is, somebody you've known your whole life. And due to the fact that they're in a crisis at that point, again, to echo the earlier panel, in many cases there might be some substance abuse involved in that also. And it's gotten to the point where you can't handle it. That's when the police are injected into these situations. Nobody calls us to say, hey, my schizophrenic child had a really good day today. Would you like to come over and meet them? That doesn't happen, right? It's only when things are out of control. And we expect 21-year-old, 22-year-old young people to, with 40 hours of training, to be able to address that flawlessly every time. So again, I agree that the system now is catching up with something that's been a crisis for 30 or 40 years in this country. And, you know, those are things. I just read something not that long ago. The new chief in Portland, Oregon was being sworn in, and she talked about refocusing her department on training. And she had a saying there, and I don't know if it was her saying, but I liked it, so I'll credit her because I don't know. She didn't credit anybody else, but it said, when you know better, you do better. And that's something that I think is one of the pillars here in the 21st century policing is a refocusing on training, and we certainly need it if we're going to be expected to be frontline social workers, marriage counselors, and, you know, all the rest of the things that sometimes come with this job.
Thank you. Now let me ask one other question, and it's open for everyone to deal with. We talked about the training piece as a part of that cultural thing to be dealt with. How do we make that change, that adjustment? Well, how many people know where your police are trained? Who knows what kind of training they get? Who pays for the training? What's the extent of it? What input do you have? on the training? Do you have any at all, a little bit or none? Now imagine all of those questions lean heavily on the response being no. You don't know. So then how do you make the change? Where do you go to try to augment the change, the improvement that you want? And based upon what has been described here, if the chief is setting an example, well, supposing the chief isn't, and from your perspective, not a person you chose in the first place, but you have got to deal with it. And how do you go about dealing with that? So I have a kind of a tug of war here as to what we do. I'm open to hearing some suggestions from members of the panel as to what would be your recommendation as to how we move forward to try to alter what that training has been or lack thereof. How do we access that process?
You know, I had the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to sit on a task force that met for about a year to try and look at police training in Connecticut. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over again was resources. You know, there are only, you know, everybody always hears the state of Connecticut is in a state of fiscal crisis, and we are. And there are only so many resources to be able, that local communities have. It's expensive to send law enforcement officers to training, that the state has put into the training council that's in charge of making sure that officers are properly trained. And I think there is a lot of validity to the argument about dwindling resources for police training. But I also buy into the argument that resources is a piece of the puzzle, but priorities is another. And so the question I always come back to in my own mind is, well, you know, we only spend 8, 10, 12 hours in training A, but we spend, you know, 3, 4, 5 times that much in use of force training, right? And so when you oftentimes try and look at the way training is devised across the country, Connecticut is modeled after the way training occurs everywhere. We have instances that don't happen frequently, that we spend an exorbitant amount of time preparing officers for. And then we have instances that happen every day, like the mental health issues and the opiate issues, and we spend far less time, right, on that type of training. Now, that isn't to say that we don't want officers to be able to go into a situation and not have to think about, you know, having to, you know, appropriately protect the people around them, right? So that isn't to say, right, that they shouldn't be trained in the use of a firearm, but it is to say at some point we have to recognize that the resource issue likely isn't going to change anytime soon, but the priorities that we set or that the community sets and that law enforcement set can help to at least start to chip away at some of this, right? So when the state of Connecticut says, we mandate, officers have to go through 60, 80, 40 hours every 3 years, right? We might not have the resources to expand that to double that. We might not be able to go from 60 hours of training to 120 hours, but we do have control over what those 60 hours are spent on. I mean, I struggled for years in the Department of Justice years ago created a program called Fair and Impartial Policing that they tried to push for officers to really be able to start to think about and talk about how implicit and unconscious bias impacts, the profession. To do the program even modestly well, it's 6 to 8 hours. And that even in of itself isn't a lot of time. I was lucky when I ran around this state if I got a department to give me 2 hours, right? And so again, now I was happy that they were doing it, so I was always happy to go and give the training and to have the dialogue, but 8 hours isn't enough. But then to condense 8 hours into 2 hours also establishes the priorities that are set in terms of what's done and why it's done. And so I do think we have to have a conversation about priorities as well as resources.
Thank you. Anyone else care to respond to that, Tamara?
Yes, I don't want to take away from the importance of training, but I don't want anyone to walk out of this room thinking that training is going to fix the problem with the culture in the police departments. And we have to go back to officer accountability and oversight, and we have to also look at how the police departments engage the community. If if the communities are aware, sometimes when we speak in public forums, we find that people don't know that there's a complaint process. We were actually in New London not too long ago. There was a public forum. There's a lot that has happened legislatively that the public isn't aware of. And one response from one of the people in the audience is how do I know my rights, or where do I go to find this information about what legislative changes have taken place? But again, what we have to do as police departments is engage our community, out with discussions, forums, or whatever, to make people aware of certain processes that have changed, and also of their right to make a complaint. And so, again, training is a beautiful thing, and I don't want to take away from that, but there are some police officers that you can't train to be the appropriate type of law enforcement officer that they should be.
Yeah, Mr. Davis, go right ahead.
So maybe a little different take on training, because I think training, it depends on what kind of training you're providing, and it depends if I just think it's very critical for a couple things. You can't have accountability inside of a police organization if you don't train people the way to do something, because the accountability would be that they're going against the best practices and training of their profession. So if you want to set standards, you have to train to those standards. Those set the expectations. That's the messaging. It's like I spent a year as a city manager. A budget is more than a spending plan. It's a values document. You're saying, what are the values of the city that you're managing? What are the values of the community? A training plan is also a value document. If your academy is full of how to use force, that's a value statement you're making versus why to use force, right? How is perishable. So you can bring that out throughout the career to make sure people stay, practice, and they can actually execute what they need to do, but why, the decision making. And so I think I agree with my colleague, if you just start coming up with fancy classes that sound good, make everybody think that things are going to change, no. If you're going to really change training to be the culture of it, which means if I'm going to train you on de-escalation, then when I look at the incident and use of force, why didn't you de-escalate? And if you didn't de-escalate, then I should hold you accountable for not living up to the training and expectations. So for many departments, training, not only is it a training, becomes a training policy, a training bulletin, which becomes an expectation. If it's not an expectation, it's just a class, then, like I agree with, it's just nice, but nothing's going to come out of it. So, but I think the investment also has to be this. Could you imagine if you went to the hospital and your doctor did something wrong and says, you know what, I just didn't have enough training this week, that I missed that class on how to remove your appendix. We can't, as a profession, once again, if we're going to be a profession, once we identify the core competencies that are required for a police officer, once you identify and define what you want the police to do in this democracy, then train people to that, and we have to make the investment, which means we're going to have to spend the money. We're going to have to make sure officers can go to the kind of training that will change their outcomes or be able to equip the community to hold them accountable for not living up to those standards. But I agree, it's training is going to be one of the key, and we're always going to find out there's not enough resources, but if it's important to us, make it happen. Now, I spent a couple times doing investigations of police departments with the Civil Rights Division. My office, as the COPS office, did kind of reviews that the chief was talking about, looking at departments. And here's what I would tell you. Anyone that invests heavy on the front end of this training on de-escalation, crisis intervention, mental illness, understanding implicit bias, procedural justice, changing the heart and soul of policing, the return on investment is usually on the other end, which is payouts, civil litigation, injuries, high attrition rates. You end up spending your money ultimately, but it's more money. It just looks different.
Thank you. Anybody else care to respond? If not, I'd like to go to whether the audience have any questions, and I'm prepared to take 2 questions. I see Ernie over here. The microphone is here, Ernie. Right here. Anybody else here is going to have a question? Microphone there. And we're going to keep them short. The shorter they are, maybe you can take in
Thank
a
you.
couple.
I'm Ernie Newton. I'm from Bridgeport. I was a former senator and now city councilman. Help me understand this. We talk about community policing. If you see something, say something. But we have police officers that see things going on every day, and they don't speak up. So that's one question. How do you ask the community if you see something to say something? And we have police officers who stand around and watch an officer maybe get out of control. That's one thing. The other thing is to the gentleman, we have unions.
Are you getting in 3 or 4 questions here, Ernie?
No, just two, Bill.
Okay, all right.
You used to let me do that in the legislature, so I appreciate that. The other thing is we have unions. So when you try to make changes, it's hard to make those changes. What do you do to get the unions to buy into those kind of changes? Because every union I know fight it.
Who are you directing that to, Ernie? Okay, Mr. Davis.
Yeah, just real quick, with the code of silence you're talking about, some people call it the blue code of silence. I think there is a code of silence. A lot of people will deny it. Officers are going to be very apprehensive in many cases to give information. So in the community, will be no snitching, and in the police department, it's a code of silence. Only thing I would ask communities to understand is why it exists. And in many cases, if you talk to officers, what the legitimacy goes to them as well. When they believe that they can't trust the politicians, no offense to the legislators here, they can't trust the city, and the community doesn't understand what they're going to do, then the only person that you can rely on is the man or woman in the car next to you who's willing to die for you, and unfortunately that means they're probably willing to lie for you. So to the extent you engage with the community and they know that there's real support, then you start to see more and more officers report that, because none of them, most officers I know don't want to work with a corrupt officer, a heavy-handed officer. We all know who the cop is that can't handle the call, because as soon as you get called to cover him or her, you'd be like, oh my God, I might as well go ahead and put my boxing gloves on because I got to fight every time I go with this person. But right now, people are afraid to do it. So it does exist. I can't speak intelligently on how widespread, but I do know why it exists, and I think the more you engage. With the unions, depends on the state, depends on them. In many cases, they're very powerful. And in some cases, people have to go through the legislature to get that taken. But I think there's still a way, is don't look at the union, in my opinion, as the enemy. Their job is to represent the interests of the officers. And I think the key's got to be is it's hard, but it's not unsurmountable. You can actually get a lot of things done. We've seen unions come to the table and make them work. And when they don't, then you need to basically go through legislative, or what I would tell a lot of community members, union contracts are a part of a local government's decision, right? Union police officer Bill of Rights are based the state legislators' decisions. The time to worry about them is not when the shooting occurred and you realize that you have the mechanisms that are in your way that you think are stopping you. The time to worry about it is when the contract's up to vote, when the bill is being on the table that provides certain rights that you think may be counter, more than just their protection, that may be counter to good, effective policing. So this is where local comes in. You get to control the laws that you pass with regards to rights, and you get to control the contracts that any union has.
Thank you. Anyone else wanted to respond to that? Anyone? Ernie got the question shot. I'm going here now. I think it's on.
Hello.
You got it, bro.
Hi, my name's Tark. I'm trying to be real clear with this question. I'm trying to, if we go past, the training of officers, if we just take 1% of law enforcement who bear witness, you got 99% committed injustices. So, my question is, ain't all this a waste of time if the judicial system doesn't see what's going on in the community? For example, I'm not going to even talk about the community who bear witness African-American handcuffed and shot in the back of the head by an officer, but his partner or maybe the police officer who witnessed it, who go to court and they got this year investigation or whatever, and he says, I witnessed this man was handcuffed, he shot him in the head, and so when the judicial system say, oh, it was justified after this so-called 1 year, 2 year investigation, how are my point is if the judicial system starts sentencing police officers to life or death row for killing African Americans and Hispanics, then I believe the police will start thinking, oh, I might go to jail if I kill him. But since the judicial system, the judge is saying, oh, it's justified, I don't see like any change happening, no matter with the training or the police officers. That's my question. Like, is there something we can do about that?
You directing that to someone in particular? Everybody?
Everybody.
Okay, everybody. Okay, who'd like to start? You get the essence of his question.
I would just say that the same cultural change that we're talking about that needs to happen in the police departments needs to happen in the judicial branch as well. And actually, if not more. And also, the other thing that is important about your question, it points to one specific thing, and that is policing is one thing, but justice you look to the judicial branch for, and what many people feel is that they're re-victimized when they get to the court system. So again, this is a great discussion we need to have because policing is local, but the court system is statewide. A lot of the lawmakers that are here in this room, a lot of the legislators and policy people, this is something we have to talk about. The real injustice happens in the judicial branch.
Two things that I want you to take a look at. So one, with the reporting, as a chief, I adopted a policy that many chiefs are adopting now, which is the failure to report makes you as guilty as the violation that you covered up. So the idea will be is if there's no accountability for silence, then you're asking me to choose between telling on my fellow officer versus maybe a high level of accountability if somehow the moral requirement doesn't hit me. But if you know from me that if I found out you were there and you didn't tell me, that's going to even be more serious than a violation that you hid, which means you'll get fired, that's one way. I want you to take a look at Graham versus Connor is the Supreme Court decision with regards to use of force by police officers in the United States. States can set their own statutes, and there's a word called objectively reasonable is the evaluation standard by which force is determined. Was it reasonable, objectively reasonable to use that force? Why the things that we all talked about are important is because if a person is objectively and reasonably fair of their life, then the officer is going to be justified. That case law, unless the Supreme Court revisits the case, is the law, right? In many cases, unless the state has something different. However, what's reasonable determines how advanced the profession ultimately becomes. If de-escalation becomes a standard in the country, then not de-escalating is no longer reasonable. Standing in front of a car and then shooting a guy for coming towards you in the car would no longer be reasonable. Shooting at a moving car would not be reasonable. Shooting a guy with a knife when you have time and distance and the ability to de-escalate, talk him or her down, recognize a crisis, and shooting a person 15 times would no longer be reasonable. And there's a difference between reasonable fear and just plain fear. And understanding bias, are you just afraid of me because I'm a big black man or because I'm doing something that would be legitimately a threat? All of that right now is not being defined other than was the officer being objectively reasonable fear. And so the court system is, in many cases, it has its own challenges as mentioned, but I think we can help the court system by raising the standard, not by changing the law because that may not occur, but raise the standard so that you're asking officers to live to a higher standard. And then some of these shootings just don't make any sense. But we also got to deal with, if I can be very candid, is in a community, as a lot of jurors have problems that even when the police department and their colleagues are saying that the cop should be held accountable, that juries are still unlikely to commit and to convict because we just don't want to believe. So the question is, what does a jury look like in your jurisdiction? If you're engaging and you got 2/3 of your African-American population that's on in some type of criminal justice system, you also mess with your voting pool and your jury pool. And so how we fight, going back to the recommendations, how you fight crime, racial profiling, mass incarceration, it affects individuals' lives, the people that we saw in the last panel, but it also has this devastating impact on the community, economic, political, and social, right? You don't get to sit on juries, you can't vote depending on the state you're in, and all of that matters if you're gonna change the kind of culture you're talking about. So I think you brought up a good point, and I would say that I still believe the vast majority of cops do a great job, but when they don't do a good job and they make the kind of mistakes, we need to have the system that holds them accountable, and that's not always in place.
Thank you, Chief.
One of the other challenges besides that we sometimes deal with here in the state of Connecticut and in other unionized environments, Mr. Newton said about unions, is I've been involved for many years. I was the commander of the Internal Affairs Division in Hartford, so it was my job to investigate citizen complaints. And I've been involved in cases where officers were arrested and then terminated for use of force incidents. And in some cases, they either went to trial and were found not guilty, or they plea bargained and were never, case never went to trial. And then they go to the state labor board, and people who've been arrested and terminated by the department are returned to work as police officers in local police departments around the state of Connecticut. And that is, you know, that can be very challenging. Those systems are supposed to be completely separate. The standard of proof is different. You go to court, if a police officer gets arrested and charged with a crime, they're treated just like any other citizen, right? You have to prove them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But that is not the standard that most people deal with in their jobs. If you are not performing your job properly, I don't need to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm supposed to take that to the preponderance of the evidence, meaning it's more likely than not that you did what a citizen complained about or what an administrator in the police department, a supervisor, accused you of. But sometimes, particularly here, the state labor board almost retries the whole thing. They call the same witnesses that were called at the trial, and they put an awful lot of weight on the fact that an officer was arrested and found not guilty when they're weighing whether or not that police officer should still come back to work, and that should not be the standard. You should not be allowed to continue in any profession if you are not performing your job, but your bosses, the organization, the administration should not have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. There's a reason that standard is there when you're talking about incarcerating somebody, but it should be different for your ability to continue in any given profession.
Thank you. Tamara, you want to say something?
Only that in Connecticut, we have a process called decertification, and if an officer engages in such misconduct and they go through the arbitration board and they get their job back, you can either through the police department or through post make a complaint, and that officer can be decertified, similar to a teacher who can't teach without certification.
Thank you. I get the distinct impression that listening to the latter half of the discussion here, it's something that means a lot to most of us in the room. Probably, no doubt, it's going to require a whole lot of engagement working to alter that process, to deal with that culture. And that's where the battle line is drawn. It was mentioned here, and I hope everybody got it, that everyone who goes away and their right to vote is taken minimizes the jury pool. That you're not there to assist in making a decision about one's innocence or guilt because you're not a part of the pool in which the selection is made. And it's not something that's, I'd imagine, is on a lot of people's minds. But it is a huge factor because it reinforces the notion that you're on the outside. You're not a part of the process. And those standards and the training that they're talked about here, whether it be the 21st century or the 22nd, it's so critical to what it is we must do as a next phase of dealing with the issue of mass incarceration. What do we do about making them whole? Not just whole as individuals, but whole as a part of the community. And that's not there. It's not there because the struggle is still on about engaging and making sure that people are a part of that wholeness of community and not certain pieces of it taken away. Unless there's some other comments or questions here, I appreciate a round of applause for our panel here. And I want you to know when I said to Chief Dryfe, that decent person, man, he's got to know when I use the word decent, that means something.
High praise.
You know? That means something. Okay, I think we're going to eat. Andrew, you going to come and say something here?
Yeah, thank you to everybody, and thank you especially to Ron for traveling such a distance to come and visit our state. Another round of applause. Thank you.